Catherine Dalton had not spoken a word in 11 days. Her throat raw from screaming into the darkness of her cabin until her voice shattered like glass against stone. And when they found her that October morning in 1871, she was kneeling beside the collapsed mare in her yard, her wedding dress torn and filthy, her hands bleeding from trying to dig a grave in the frozen Montana earth with nothing but her bare fingers and a rusted spoon. The horse was dying, its labored breathing rattling through broken ribs, and Catherine understood dying things because she herself had died the moment Robert Thorne rode away from their planned wedding with another woman, leaving her rejected in front of the entire settlement of Timber Creek, her humiliation so complete that even the preacher had looked away in pity. She had become a rejected woman in a place where women were scarce, and rejection meant something worse than death. It meant being invisible, being whispered about, being the cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about trusting the wrong man. The mare had wandered into her yard 3 days ago, appearing out of the western wilderness with wounds that spoke of violence and distance, and Catherine had seen in those suffering eyes the same abandonment she felt in her own soul, the same desperate need to be worth saving, even when the world had decided you were not. If stories of the rejected finding purpose in the most unlikely places call to your heart, if you understand that sometimes what we rescue ends up rescuing us, subscribe now, because this journey into what the West brought back will change everything you thought you knew about survival and revenge. Catherine was 31 years old and had come to Montana Territory in the spring of 1869 as a mail-order bride for a rancher named William Dalton, a decent man 20 years her senior, who had treated her with kindness until consumption took him 18 months after their wedding, leaving her with a small homestead, 40 acres of stubborn land, and a name that meant respectability in a place where such things mattered. She had mourned William honestly because he had been good to her, and when Robert Thorne started courting her in the spring of 1871, she had believed his promises about building a life together, about her never being alone again, about love being possible even in this harsh country. Robert was 34, handsome in the way frontier men could be when they still had all their teeth and enough charm to make lies sound like poetry, and he had courted her properly for 5 months before proposing marriage in front of the entire community at the Independence Day celebration. The rejection came 6 weeks later on what should have been their wedding day, when Robert rode into town with Sarah Winthrop, the 17-year-old daughter of the richest mine owner in the territory, and announced to everyone gathered at the church that he had made a mistake, that his heart belonged to another, that Catherine should understand. It was nothing personal. The rejected woman had stood there in her carefully sewn dress, watching her future dissolve like smoke, and the looks on the faces of the congregation told her everything she needed to know about how a rejected woman was viewed in a place where survival often depended on community acceptance. She had retreated to her homestead and locked herself away, and for 11 days she had existed in a darkness so complete that food lost all taste and time lost all meaning, and she might have stayed in that darkness forever if the dying horse had not appeared. The mare was a dun-colored creature, muscular despite her injuries, and the wounds covering her body told a story Catherine could read as clearly as words on a page. Bullet graze across the shoulders, rope burns on the legs, and a brand that had been deliberately burned over, obscured, hidden. This was a stolen horse, or a horse that had escaped from something terrible, and the fact that she had come from the west meant she had crossed the Bitterroot Range, had traveled through Nez Perce and Salish territory, had survived a journey that should have killed her. Catherine brought water and what little grain she had, and she sat with the dying horse through that first night, talking to her in whispers, telling her about rejection and abandonment, and how sometimes living felt like a punishment worse than any death could be. The horse did not die that night, and Catherine took this as a sign of something, though she could not name what. She cleaned the wounds as best she could, using techniques she had learned from her late husband, and she noticed details that made her hands shake, with a recognition she did not want to acknowledge. The horse wore a saddle pad that had been cut away but not completely removed, and when Catherine examined it closely, she saw initials stitched into the fabric, RT. And her blood went cold because those were Robert Thorne's initials, and she knew with absolute certainty that this horse had come from wherever Robert had gone after he rejected her and married Sarah Winthrop. The rejected woman stood in her yard holding that piece of fabric, and something shifted inside her, something that transformed grief into curiosity, and curiosity into a hunger for truth that felt like the first real emotion she had experienced since becoming a rejected woman standing alone at a church altar. Over the next 3 days, Catherine nursed the horse with an intensity that bordered on obsession, and the mare responded, growing stronger. And as the animal healed, Catherine began to search her more carefully, looking for clues. She found them in the saddlebags, still partially attached to the mare's flanks, hidden under the dried blood and trail dust. Papers, letters, a journal written in Robert's distinctive hand. Catherine read by candlelight, and what she discovered made her understand that rejection had saved her from something far worse than loneliness. Robert Thorne was not who he claimed to be. His real name was Robert Thornton, and he was wanted in 3 territories for fraud, theft, and murder. He had a pattern. He married women of means, wealthy widows, or daughters of prosperous men, and then he disappeared with their money and property, leaving behind bodies when necessary. Sarah Winthrop's father owned the largest silver mine in western Montana, and Robert had targeted her deliberately, had courted and rejected Catherine the moment a better opportunity presented itself, and the rejected woman realized that her humiliation had prevented her from becoming another victim in a trail of destruction that stretched back years. But there was more in those papers, details that made Catherine's hands shake as she read. Robert had not simply married Sarah and disappeared with her father's wealth. He had taken Sarah west into the wilderness, supposedly on a honeymoon journey, along with her father's payroll, $40,000 in gold meant to pay the miners. The journal entries were sparse but damning, and the last entry was dated only 8 days ago, written in a hand that had become increasingly erratic. The woman asks too many questions. The guides have become suspicious. We are 3 days west of Bitterroot Pass. May have to accelerate timeline. The horse is too recognizable. We'll need to dispose of it. Catherine read that line again and again, and she understood that the dying horse in her yard had not simply escaped. It had been sent away, or had fled, and it had traveled more than 100 miles through mountain wilderness to reach her homestead, as if the animal itself knew that something terrible was happening and had chosen to bring evidence to the one person who might understand its significance. The rejected woman sat with those papers and understood that she had a choice. She could take this evidence to the territorial marshal in Bannock, could report what she knew, and let the law handle it, and that would be the reasonable thing to do, the safe thing, the thing a proper widow should do. Or she could saddle her own horse, follow the trail the dying mare had left, and discover for herself what the West had brought back. What truth lay beyond those mountains? What had happened to Robert Thorne and Sarah Winthrop and $40,000 in gold? The rejected woman thought about Sarah, barely more than a girl, probably believing every lie Robert told her the way Catherine herself had believed those same lies, and she thought about how rejection had felt like an ending, but might actually be the beginning of something else entirely. Catherine spent 2 days preparing. She gathered supplies, ammunition for her husband's rifle, dried food, and warm clothing, and she studied the maps William had kept of the Bitterroot region, tracing possible routes westward. The dying horse, who Catherine had begun calling Testament because she carried testimony of crimes, grew stronger each day, and Catherine recognized in the mare's recovery a kind of mirror to her own transformation. The rejected woman was becoming something else, someone who understood that sometimes the worst things that happen to us are preparation for moments when we must be stronger than we ever imagined possible. She wrote a letter to her nearest neighbor, explaining only that she was traveling west for personal business, and she left instructions about her property in case she did not return, because she was realistic enough to know that a woman traveling alone into wilderness where men disappeared with stolen gold was unlikely to find anything but trouble. On the morning of October 18, 1871, Catherine Dalton rode west from her homestead, following the trail she believed Testament had taken in reverse. The land beyond Timber Creek was brutal in autumn, aspens turning gold against dark pine forests, and the mountains rising ahead like a wall between the known world and whatever lay beyond. She tracked carefully, looking for signs of recent passage, and she found them in broken branches and disturbed earth, in places where horses had been tied and camps made hastily. The rejected woman rode through territory claimed by the Salish people, and on the second day, she encountered 3 hunters who regarded her with curiosity and suspicion. She showed them the brand that had been burned over on Testament, and the oldest hunter, a man who introduced himself as Many Elk, studied it carefully before speaking. "This mark was changed to hide theft," he said in English mixed with his own language. "We have seen white men moving through our territory with pack horses and a woman. 4 men and 1 woman heading toward the old trapping trails near Lolo Pass. They move like men who do not want to be followed. Catherine thanked them with trade goods, tobacco and coffee, and many elk looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You are following them," he said, and it was not a question. "Yes," Catherine answered, and she did not elaborate because what could she say? That she was a rejected woman seeking truth, that she needed to know what the West had brought back, that her humiliation had become a kind of compass pointing towards something she did not yet understand. "The woman with them is very young," Many Elk said quietly. "She does not speak much anymore. Her eyes are frightened." Catherine felt something cold settle in her chest, and she asked, "How many days ahead are they?" Many Elk considered, then held up 3 fingers. 3 days, maybe less. They camp long in one place, like they are waiting for something or deciding something. Catherine understood what that meant. Robert was planning his next move, probably trying to determine how to dispose of Sarah and disappear with the gold, and she wondered if Sarah had begun to suspect, if the young bride had started to see through the lies, the way Catherine had been too naive to do until after the rejection. Pause here and answer me this. If you discovered that rejection had saved you from a terrible fate, would you ride into danger to save the woman who replaced you, or would you let justice take its natural course? If being a rejected woman gave you knowledge that could prevent murder, what would you do? Drop your truth in the comments. Catherine pushed harder, rising before dawn and riding until darkness made travel impossible. And on the 5th day, she found their camp, or what remained of it. The site was in a clearing near a stream, and the evidence of occupation was clear: multiple fire rings, areas where horses had been picketed, and signs of argument or struggle in the way supplies had been scattered. Catherine dismounted and searched carefully, and she found items that made her blood run cold. A woman's torn shawl caught on a bush, drops of blood on the ground leading into the forest, and most damning, a hastily dug hole that had been started and then abandoned, as if someone had begun to dig a grave and then changed their mind or been interrupted. The rejected woman stood in that clearing and understood that whatever had happened here, it had been recent, possibly within the last day, and that Sarah Winthrop was either already dead or very close to dying. She followed the blood trail into the forest, moving as quietly as William had taught her during their brief marriage, and after a quarter-mile, she heard voices, men arguing in the harsh tones of a disagreement that had gone beyond reason. Catherine tied her horse and moved forward on foot, the rifle heavy in her hands, and through the trees she saw them. 4 men around a small fire, and Robert Thorne was unmistakable even at this distance, his handsome face twisted with frustration as he argued with 3 rougher-looking men who Catherine assumed were the guides he had hired to bring them through the wilderness. Sarah Winthrop was there too, sitting apart from the men, her hands bound in front of her, her dress filthy and torn, her face showing bruises that had not come from falling on rough terrain. The rejected woman watched and listened, and she heard Robert say, "We discussed this. She has become a liability. Her father will have sent people looking by now, and she can identify all of us. We take the gold, and we leave no witnesses." One of the guides, a heavy man with a scarred face, shook his head. "You said this would be simple. Rob a rich man's daughter, take the payroll, disappear. You did not say anything about killing a girl who has done nothing but trust the wrong man." Robert's laugh was bitter. "Trust is her crime. Trust makes her dangerous. We do this tonight, bury her deep, and we split the gold 4 ways at Missoula. Anyone who has a problem with that can walk away right now with nothing." The scarred guide stood up. "I have done bad things, Thorne, but I do not kill girls who have only been stupid. Count me out." He started to walk away, and Robert drew his pistol so quickly that Catherine barely saw the movement, and the shot echoed through the forest like thunder. The guide fell, blood spreading across his chest, and the other 2 men jumped back, their hands going to their own weapons, but Robert was already pointing the gun at them. "Anyone else have moral objections?" he asked, and his voice was calm, almost pleasant. "We are past the point where anyone gets to leave. You are in this now, both of you, and that means we finish what we started." Catherine watched Sarah's face and saw the moment when the young bride understood that she was going to die, and the rejected woman recognized that expression because she had felt it herself when she stood alone at the church. That moment when the future you imagined crumbles into nothing, and you realize that the person you trusted most in the world is a stranger wearing a familiar face. But Catherine had survived rejection, and she had used that survival to become something harder. And as she watched Robert prepare to murder an innocent girl, she understood that being a rejected woman had given her a kind of freedom that came from having nothing left to lose. She raised the rifle, sighted carefully the way William had taught her during their evenings practicing for hunting season, and she fired. The bullet took Robert in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping his pistol, and Catherine worked the bolt and fired again. This shot deliberate, placing the bullet into the ground near the feet of the remaining 2 guides. "The next one will not miss," she called out, stepping into the clearing with the rifle steady on her shoulder. "You have a choice. You can run right now, take horses and supplies and disappear into the wilderness, or you can stay and die with the man who just murdered your friend." The 2 guides looked at each other, at the dead man bleeding into the forest floor, at Robert clutching his shattered shoulder and screaming curses, and then they ran, crashing through the undergrowth like panicked deer, leaving behind their gear and their share of the gold and any pretense that they had ever been anything but cowards looking for easy money. Catherine kept the rifle trained on Robert as she moved to Sarah, cutting the ropes that bound the girl's hands. Sarah stared at her, confusion and recognition fighting for space on her bruised face. "You are," she began, and then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "I am the rejected woman," Catherine said quietly. "The one he left at the altar. The one who was humiliated so that he could marry you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I did not know. I did not understand." Catherine looked at the younger woman and felt something complicated. Not quite forgiveness, but not hatred either. More like a recognition that they were both victims of the same man's lies, and that rejection had saved Catherine while acceptance had nearly destroyed Sarah. What the West brought back was truth, Catherine said. "And now we both know who he really is." Robert was trying to reach his pistol, dragging himself across the ground with his good arm, and Catherine walked over and kicked the weapon away. "You rejected me," she said, and her voice was steady. "You made me a rejected woman in front of everyone who mattered in my life. You turned me into an object of pity and gossip. But that rejection gave me something you can never take away. It gave me clarity. It gave me the ability to see through lies. And it gave me the freedom to ride into this wilderness and stop you from murdering an innocent girl the way you have probably murdered others." Robert looked up at her, his face pale with shock and pain, and he tried to smile, tried to summon the charm that had worked on so many women. "Catherine," he said, "you have to understand. I never meant to hurt you. I cared about you. She cut him off. "You are going to tell me exactly where Sarah's father's gold is, and then you are going to confess to everything you have done, and then I am going to take you back to face justice. And if you refuse, I will leave you here with your shattered shoulder and let the wilderness decide your fate." It took 3 days to get back to civilization. Catherine had found the gold, hidden in a cave a half-mile from the camp, $40,000 in small bars and coin, and she loaded it onto the pack horses Robert's guides had abandoned. She bound Robert's wound enough to keep him from bleeding to death, but she did not make him comfortable, and she listened to him alternate between pleading and threatening during the entire journey. Sarah rode beside her in silence most of the time, sometimes crying, sometimes just staring at the mountains as if she could not quite believe she was still alive. On the second night, as they camped in a sheltered valley, Sarah finally spoke. "Why did you save me?" she asked. "I took your place. I am the reason you were rejected." Catherine poked at the fire and considered her answer. "You did not take anything," she said finally. "He was never mine to lose. And I saved you because I know what it feels like to be the woman left behind. And I did not want you to be the woman buried in an unmarked grave. The West brought back truth, and the truth is that we are not enemies. We are both just women who believed the wrong man." They reached Bannock on October 27, 1871, and the territorial marshal met them with a combination of disbelief and professional interest. Catherine told him everything, showed him the papers and journals she had found in Testament saddlebags, and presented him with Robert Thornton, wanted under 3 names in multiple territories. Sarah confirmed every detail, adding her own testimony about the plan to murder her and steal her father's fortune. The marshal listened carefully, and then he looked at Catherine with something like wonder. "You tracked him alone into the Bitterroots," he said. "You faced down 4 armed men. You brought back the victim, the criminal, and the stolen gold. And you did this why?" Catherine thought about rejection, about how it had felt like death but had actually been liberation, about how the worst day of her life had prepared her for this moment. "Because I am a rejected woman," she said simply. "And being rejected taught me that I do not need anyone's approval to know my own worth." The story of the rejected woman who saved the young bride spread quickly through Montana Territory, and Catherine found that the whispers had changed. She was no longer pitiful or shameful. She was the woman who had ridden into the wilderness alone, who had faced down killers, who had brought justice when no one else even knew a crime was being committed. Sarah's father offered her a substantial reward, and Catherine accepted enough to secure her homestead and ensure she would never have to depend on anyone's charity again. Sarah herself stayed in Bannock for several weeks, recovering from her ordeal, and before she left to return to her father's house, she came to Catherine's homestead one last time. "I want to thank you," she said. "I want to understand why you saved me when you had every reason to let me die." Catherine looked at the younger woman, at the bruises fading and the strength returning, and she thought about Testament, the horse who had carried evidence of crimes across 100 miles of wilderness, who had survived wounds that should have killed her, because sometimes survival is the only revenge that matters. "I saved you because rejection taught me something important," Catherine said. "It taught me that when the world decides you are worthless, you have two choices. You can believe them and fade away, or you can prove that your worth was never dependent on being chosen by the right man or accepted by the right people." The West brought back more than just truth about Robert. It brought back understanding that being a rejected woman made me strong enough to become the person who saves others from similar fates. And that is worth more than any wedding ever could be. Robert Thornton was tried in Virginia City in November of 1871 and convicted of murder, attempted murder, fraud, and theft. He was hanged on December 3rd, and Catherine did not attend the execution. She had no interest in watching him die. She had already moved past him, had already transformed rejection into purpose, and watching him pay for his crimes would not change anything about who she had become. Testament, the horse who had brought the evidence that saved Sarah's life, lived on Catherine's homestead for 7 more years, never ridden hard again, honored for the journey that had changed everything. And Catherine herself became known throughout the territory not as the rejected woman, but as the woman who proved that sometimes what looks like an ending is actually the beginning of becoming someone stronger than you ever imagined possible. She never married again, not because she was bitter or afraid, but because she had learned that her value was not measured by being chosen, and that lesson was worth more than any romantic promise could ever be. Stories like this remind us that rejection can be a gift in disguise, that sometimes the worst moments of our lives prepare us for the heroic moments we could never have anticipated, that what the West brought back was not just gold or justice, but the truth that survival itself is a form of courage. If this story of the rejected woman finding her purpose in saving the life of the woman who replaced her moved you, hit that like button, leave a comment about what rejection has taught you, and subscribe for more tales of the frontier that challenge everything you thought you knew about strength and redemption.